I was actually working at the Coast Guard Academy in New London, Connecticut for the superintendent, and I was also a company officer. My collateral duty was aide to the superintendent. The superintendent got promoted. He was selected to be the Pacific Area Commander, who resided in San Francisco. And he asked me as his aide in Connecticut if I would transfer and be his aide to the Pacific Area Commander. So I said yes.
Now, you're still with your family?
So Ted just got married to my wife, who is from Connecticut. So that was a short-lived visit to the state of Connecticut, and headed out, just my wife and I, to San Francisco. So the tour there was all about speech writing, logistics. The Admiral traveled around the world, literally and figuratively, did presentations at embassies in Korea. We went to small tropical islands, Johnson Atoll, Yap. Went to very interesting places. We continued on through Japan, down to New Zealand and Australia, all on official business, because we were, the Admiral was interested in making connections with shipping industries in those countries who helped out internationally during search and rescue cases on the open oceans.
What were these, you had to help with writing the speeches and all, what was the basic nature of these speeches? I mean, they were different in different places, or was there a theme?
The theme really was appreciation for them being able to chop into a system where they reported their positions, so that if there was an international SART case, which there were several, with a plane down in the middle of the Red Sea or the Indian Ocean or whatever, then who's ever in charge of the search would know the facilities in the area. And they were not required to report, but they did report, and the Admiral was encouraging that by appreciating those that participated in it. Went to different embassies. A lot of foreign countries like the Philippines try to model their Coast Guard and their armies and navies on our U.S. Coast Guard, because it was humanitarian in nature, but yet was a military force. And they like the model of that. So the detail of some of the speeches was about that.
Okay. So there are numerous admirals all over that area, right? He's obviously not the one, but he was the director of all of them? Or?
He was the highest ranking Coast Guard official, and in San Francisco Bay, where there was a strong naval presence at that time, he was the senior military officer. He outranked a lower Navy rear admiral. And so when something of a significant nature came about, he was really the senior official. And I'll give you, for instance, instead of the state dinner being held at the White House for Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip, the state dinner was held in San Francisco. And so the Reagans hosted it in San Francisco, which then catapulted the Coast Guard presence, because the Britannia, the royal yacht where the Queen and Prince stayed in San Francisco Harbor, was protected by the United States Coast Guard. And all the activities associated with the state dinner at various parts honoring the royal couple, the Coast Guard had a strong presence in both on land and on the water.
And what was your job during that state visit?
It was quite interesting, actually, because only 30 people in the country were invited to a private breakfast honoring the Queen. And the Admiral told me that, of course, I had to prepare gifts, those kinds of things, for the Admiral to give, but he told me that I probably wouldn't be allowed in. But if I could get myself in, that was just fine with him. So the invitations were very tight, as you can imagine. But I held the Admiral's invitation in my hand when I introduced him to the security and protocol people at Davie Symphony Hall for a private breakfast and then a show. And they welcomed the Admiral and his wife in, and because I had the invitation in my hand, they just pushed me through. And it was quite fun because I met Robin Williams there, actor, and I was standing against a wall that had figures of leaders in the San Francisco area. And I had my uniform on with a big gold agolette on, and I moved. And Robin Williams came up to me and said, "Oh, you're real." And he sort of jumped into character with his voices and whatever, because behind me was a portrait of a naval officer, sort of like Napoleon-ish, and I must have looked like that against the wall. So he was just making small talk, and it was really fun. And then the show was the best of San Francisco, Tony Bennett, and it was just a wonderful time. So, here again, I never thought the Coast Guard would propel me to be involved in this kind of thing, because that's not what you think of when you think of the United States Coast Guard. So the tour was a lot of travel, a lot of speeches, a lot of gifts, a lot of logistics, and very enlightening for me on a bigger scale, because I saw things of national security interest that I didn't know about nor could talk about, but I wouldn't have been exposed any other way.
I have a trivial question for you. How do you choose a gift for the Queen?
It's very difficult because there are restrictions not only from the royal side about what they're allowed to receive, but from the United States government on ethics and what you're allowed to spend. So tried to make it more personal. So the gift actually turned out to be a photograph of the Britannia coming in, and also a picture of the Reagans and of the royal couple with the Admiral when they were in port. Because you're right, an engraved glass of what? So it was very difficult, but in essence, it was pretty easy because it was about them visiting.
Yeah, and actually, that's something that they would be proud to put up on a wall somewhere, is to be able to say to people, that's when we came in to San, and there's the people we were with.
Right, and as a
Smart.
result of that gift, of course, then each of the U.S. people got a copy, so, so they received a gift as well.
Oh, that's great. So where did you go from there? I mean, how do you top meeting the Queen?
Well,
And the president, I suppose.
right. Well, and the president was there.
Yeah.
Of course, he was the host. So from there, though, a couple things happened. My first child was born, and I was supposed to be with the Admiral in Alaska. And the Admiral had 6 children. And he was never there for any of the births of his children, because at that time, that wasn't a thing that husbands went to, really. They, anyway, it was that time. So I requested to stay home from Alaska because my first child was going to be born, and my wife wanted me to be there. And the Admiral said no. He wanted me to be with him, and this was a trip that he needed my help with. So I came home and told my wife, and my wife spoke with the Admiral's wife, and all of a sudden I wasn't going to Alaska, and I was at home. And my oldest child is named Maxwell Harrison Larkin Smith, and the Larkin is after Admiral Larkin, who was my boss and let me stay
Well, with some help.
with some help. And to this day, my children call Admiral and Mrs. Larkin Grandma and Grandpa Larkin, and I'm going to see them this week, actually. So we're very close.
So, where did you go from there then?
Well, usually if you work for an admiral directly, there was nobody between us. It was the admiral and me. And you normally get what you want if the admiral likes you. And we had a great relationship. I tried to lighten him up because he wasn't a funny guy. In fact, when the speeches I would write, I would put in some funny things, and I would have to write it and block it out saying, pause for applause. And he would read the speech and say, and pause for applause. And that was the only time everybody laughed at his speeches, is because he read them right from the thing. Anyway, I knew not to do that the second time, but it was rather funny. And we had a lot of those kinds of incidents. So I asked for graduate school in public relations. So I was, first you get selected to go, and then you apply to schools to see who will let you in. So I applied and was accepted to the Newhouse School of Communications at Syracuse University. Very prestigious program. They had a military photojournalist course there that is really world-renowned, and it was a comfortable setting because there were other military people at a major university, which doesn't often happen. So when the admiral's change of command happened, that was my last day as his aide. He retired, actually, and I went off to graduate school.
So actually the timing worked out because he was so dependent upon you, but he was going to retire anyways, and so
Right.
it just worked out.
That's right. I, in the interim, had worked for other admirals before him, but they weren't retiring. They were just moving on. So I felt a special connection to him, and it made it very special that he made my selection happen to go to graduate school.
So what was that experience like?
Very arduous. I was, by that point, almost 10 years out of school from my undergraduate, which was in history government. I hadn't studied theory of public relations. I hadn't been in a regular university setting because I went to the Coast Guard Academy, which was a military facility. So it was fun, but it was a lot of work. And I was in a 2-year program, and I got to take exciting courses, things that would help me through later life. I mean, photography I took, and more writing, and theory and the relativity of public relations and marketing and communications. All those skill sets were refined now with a background, and I had the head of the department as my sponsor mentor. And there was a lot more work than everybody else had, but I really liked it, except it was Syracuse in the winter. I had forgotten that Syracuse is a snow place.
Buffalo, Syracuse, Rochester. Yep.
Right. And my vehicle at the time initially was a MGB, not a good snow car. So we got a town and country because at this point we had one child. And then during the course of my 2-year school at Syracuse, I added 2 more children. So I was doing more than studying, obviously, but it was a great experience. And then at the end of that, I was working with the detailer. That's the person that assigns your next place of duty. And he told me to prepare to be going to Washington State, to Washington, to be the public affairs officer in Seattle. That's what I was trained for, so I was ready to do that. The day before the movers were to arrive, to take my stuff to move us to Seattle, Washington, I got a phone call from the detailer who told me I was really en route to Washington. And I said, I know that. Well, they're coming tomorrow and we're heading out to Seattle and we're thrilled. And he said, no, you don't understand. You're going to a different Washington now. So I then became the chief of officer recruiting at Coast Guard headquarters in Washington, D.C. And that threw me for a loop because now I have a family of three, actually 5 of us, 3 children. And Washington, D.C. is very expensive. So I thought I was going to a more affordable place in Seattle. However, the job was wonderful. I went to Washington, found a home in a suburb there, Springfield, added several more children, but it was an exciting time, and I was selected to be the liaison to the inaugural committee. And that was just fun and incredible. And so I was making choices about who was coming into the Coast Guard. Many of the people that applied to be officers in the Coast Guard, because I handled only officer programs, I had known when they were enlisted. So I was selecting them for further training to go to officer candidate school. So that was very rewarding, but also it was a different change of pace. And I traveled and did recruiting. The most uncomfortable part of that was we were trying to make movement in the diversity area in the all-white male Coast Guard. And so I was recruiting at HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities, of which there is a system. So I'm the Caucasian at the HBCU recruiting young, interested black leaders to come into the United States Coast Guard, with very few examples of how successful they would be because there were not a lot of role models. However, there was a role model, Tim Tillman, in my class when I graduated from the academy, so I leaned on him for ways to be successful doing it. And I met the challenge, if you will, and I learned a lot from that experience.
Did you find, what was not your reaction, what was the reaction of the people when you went to these? Did you like gather them together in an auditorium and make a presentation, or how did that work?
It was interesting because it was different each place. Sometimes it was, this person is coming from the United States Coast Guard, and there are opportunities here, sign up if you want to talk to them. So, I remember doing a couple interviews in Oklahoma, and the students there were trying to figure out what the Coast Guard really was, more than really being interested in the Coast Guard. And that was okay. But when I went to some very strong down south, historically black colleges and university, they had huge rallies, and I was like at the end of the auditorium after the rally, and the rally was about issues on campus or whatever, and then I was available to talk to. But I had never been in a situation where I was the minority before, and especially a minority in a uniform. And so it gave me a strong sense of what I was really working with in terms of bringing an African American or black young man into an all-white Coast Guard, while I was experiencing the reverse when I was at their universities. Very humbling, not scary, just uncomfortable.
But I think part of it, you pointed this out, is not just being Caucasian, but being in uniform.
Yes.
It's two separate things. Even if an African American Coast Guard person came in a uniform, there would be a reaction to the uniform.
Right, and for time and dates, this was let's see, when I was doing that part, 1986 to 1990. Um, you know, the uniform was not, you didn't, I don't know how to say this best, but there were some places you didn't want to wear your uniform to recruit. And of course I had to. But yeah, it just, yeah, the national fever was not necessarily a pro-military on a college campus.
Right, right. So, without going into statistics or numbers, did the Coast Guard actually improve the diversity
They
over
did.
time?
They did. We created a special programming opportunities. We had a direct commission program that skipped a couple of beats. And with that, there were some challenges. I was recruiting from the inner city, if you will. So we were collecting inner city minorities who didn't have some of the same skill sets, just by virtue, really, of their background. And one, for instance, is swimming. So we had to create a special swimming program and working with the Navy up in Newport, Rhode Island, so that after we selected some individuals, they went, and part of their training was to go up to Newport, Rhode Island to learn how to swim, because that was not a skill set generally that the minorities that I was recruiting had.
Did you find, let me put it this way, and then you can answer it whichever way you want. When Jackie Robinson was first put into the major leagues, it was a major event historically. We look back on it now as a great thing, but it was not easy for him at all. I mean, that's even an understatement. When women were allowed into the military, there was a lot of what's the polite word of saying it? There was a lot of disagreement about whether or not this should be done or not. What did you find, if you don't mind my asking that, in terms of bringing in minorities into this organization that has been predominantly a white one?
Well, I can answer both questions from a unique experience, because I was at the Coast Guard Academy with the first class of women, which changed all the rules, and they didn't change them right away. So the academy and the staff were bleeding a little, if I could use that word, in terms of trial and error of welcoming women to an all-male institution whose leadership graduated from an all-male institution, whose knowledge of the institution was about all males. And so I learned a lot about welcoming a diverse population to the academy through that. So now in recruiting, when I'm now introducing yet another diverse population, which is African Americans and others, it was, there was a lot of new rules. There was a lot of things that needed to be rewritten because they weren't just going to work. And it wasn't necessarily the visual appearance, it was how can we make minorities comfortable within the setting that before denied them entry. And, you know, you're changing history. You know, and Michael J. Smith was not going to rewrite the history books. But, you know, the first group had a lot harder time than the second group. And the second group had a lot harder time. You know, it was progression, but eventually everybody was comfortable with the changes.
African Americans, Latinos, Asians?
Asians,
Too?
yes.
All right, so there was an effort not just to focus on one particular group, but just to get it more multicultural, if you will, or more
Correct.
yeah.
Correct.
Well, I find that interesting because I do have a good sense of history, and it has not been easy to do those sorts of things. And we have examples of, violence and things going on when you try to do that.
Right.
Did you find anything that was that much out? I mean, you don't have to answer it if you don't want to, but did you find that there were examples of people that were not going to take this?
Not from the people I was trying to entice to come
Right.
in, but yes, from the others,
Yeah.
from the institutionalized people that were my bosses, perhaps, even though it was mandated that we change. Some folks were adamant about not changing anything to make it appear that it was easier to come in. But it really wasn't about easy. It was more about comfort and intertwining folks. And we didn't have a strong history of how to do that.
Yeah. You know, the boot camp part of it, where you're yelling at anybody no matter what their color is, I mean, I guess it levels it out in that respect.
Yes.
And so when you do bring somebody into a military environment and you put them through that rigor, as long as you are putting everybody through that rigor, then it should eventually balance out.
Yes, but realizing that the people that were selected to come to the academies all came as a result of where they came from and who they were. And although we claim, when you asked a question about bias and bigotry, we claim always never to have that. In fact, we have some of that built in. It's what we know. And depending on where you come from, in my particular case, my father was the chief of police. And, you know, the criminals, if you will, and the people that he talked about were not necessarily our Anglo-Saxon neighbors. So I heard a lot of stuff, and I didn't live in a community. I went to a private high school that had no minorities, none. And then I went to a military academy where there were a couple, you know, and the joke was, you know, that diversity at the time was Polish. And coincidentally, I'm living in a town that's very similar to those kinds of things. We're working through that, but yeah.
I have to commend you for you know, not only the effort itself, but that you actually could see beyond where you grew up and realize that this is something that you were tasked to do, and you had to do it well, and you were able to get through it. That's amazing. So where was your next step?
So that was a 4-year tour.
Okay.
And it was a long tour. But it was a wonderful tour. Again, it had another experience that I didn't have, that I didn't think that the Coast Guard would provide me. Made me uncomfortable at times, but yet gave me the strength of character to move on. Well, I was working in an office where the chief of enlisted recruiting was leaving before me. I was coming in for a year, working alongside, then he was going someplace. And where did he go for my 3 years back at Coast Guard headquarters? He came to be the group commander in a place called Grand Haven, Michigan. So the chief of enlisted recruiting left from Washington and came here as a group commander. Well, he was ready to transfer when I was done as the chief of officer recruiting. And he said, you need to get this job. And I did. I was selected to become the commander after him as the group commander, Grand Haven.
Now, is that a plum position?
Yes, for a multitude of reasons. It's a city that loves the Coast Guard because it's a city whose heritage as Coast Guard City involved this stationing of 12 ships, but the losing of 101 sons on the tragedy of the Escanaba. No other city, no other Coast Guard relationship had that. This was the place. In Grand Haven, Michigan, we had life-saving services that turned into search and rescue stations. We had lighthouse services that turned into U.S. Coast Guard lighthouses and a lighthouse system. We had the district headquarters in Grand Haven, Michigan, which eventually became the district admiral headquarters in Cleveland, Ohio. We had one of everything. We had a World War II Coast Guard training camp on the grounds where my office was at 650 South Harbor in Grand Haven, Michigan, is the building that then was called the group headquarters. And it was in a place called Mulligan's Hollow, which is, everybody knows the YMCA is in Mulligan's Hollow. Well, Mulligan's Hollow was the World War II Coast Guard training camp. We have pictures of it. It was set up like that. So the connecting pieces, there was a rifle range over in Ferrysburg. No other city in the world had the connecting piece or the relationship. And I had heard about Grand Haven when I was a cadet because I came on board a ship during a summer program, and we were wined and dined. And my first recollection of coming to Grand Haven when I was a young cadet, stepping off the ship, was I went to a diner, which has now come to be the Delight that I know. And I ordered breakfast and talked to the young waitress, excuse me, who then invited me home to meet her parents for dinner, not in any other way than being friendly.
Water? Want to get some water?
It should be okay. So I knew that this place was special. So when I had the chance to request the orders to come, I knew it was going to be great. But it turned out to be great in a different way. So now I arrived with my family, and now I'm a family of 7. We have 5 children, and my wife was expecting our 6th child. And it was a group command, meaning I was in charge of the search and rescue stations from Traverse City down just short of Chicago. And all those search and rescue facilities, summer and year-round stations, reported to me. So it was filled with real people. And I had some real experiences with the real people. I experienced almost one of everything in a command setting, in some cases 2. I had 2 suicides. I had an operational death where one of my guys at Station Grand Haven ran over and killed a new seaman he had just reported in the water in the government basin, which turned into then a court-martial. I mean, the emotion of that for my young man who accidentally ran him over. And, you know, I never thought I would be giving a eulogy in Dayton, Ohio for an 18-year-old captain of the wrestling team who came into the Coast Guard because that's what he wanted to do, and 7 months later was killed. Those are the kinds of experiences where happy Grand Haven Coast Guard City was not what I thought I would experience, yet it's the real Coast Guard with real people, with real problems. We had exciting Coast Guard search and rescue cases, and we had a lot of visitors. And then we had the fun-filled Grand Haven Coast Guard Festival, which honored the people that I was a part of. The active duty Coast Guard, retired Coast Guard, civilians, reserves, and auxiliaries. And it was truly a celebration. So despite the heartache of having a command, there certainly was rewards in knowing that everything I did was appreciated. I was invited as guests to so many things that were out of my element, but really people were just so kind. And if you remember, I started with that I'm from right outside New York City. When people are kind to you there, you're suspicious of their intent. In Grand Haven, it comes from the heart. And it was just an incredible setting. I baptized my new child at the lighthouse in Grand Haven. And all my sons have Coast Guard part of their names. I indicated that my oldest son, Larkin, was Admiral. My second son is Madison, named after Admiral Madison, Matteson, who was my boss when he was born in Washington, D.C. Mikhail, my youngest son, is Mikhail after Mikhail's Navy. Mikhail Mulligan after Mulligan's Hollow, World War II Coast Guard training camp where my office was when he was born. And when the priest, or Catholic, baptized him, he said, "What name do you give your son?" We said, "Mikhail Mulligan." He said, "What Christian name do you give your son?" We said, "Mikhail Mulligan." He said, "There's no Saint Mikhail, and there's no Saint Mulligan." When we said, "Well, there could be if you give him a chance," he said, "It will be Mikhail Mulligan Michael." So my son is Mikhail Mulligan Michael, baptized at the lighthouse in Grand Haven.
You know, I was gonna tease you about the McHale's thing, figuring that there probably was some big McHale somewhere, but then you cut me off. I couldn't even make the joke.
Sorry.
It is McHale's Navy.
It is from Mikhail's Navy. My dad was in the Navy.
Yeah.
And I was born in 1953. I'm the product of TV.
Sure, of course.
And so we loved to watch that show, and I just like the name.
Well, yeah.
And all my children's first names begin with an M.
Yeah.
So we were running out. So that tour, I didn't want to leave. I was extended for a year. So I had 4 years instead of 3. And I knew that my children needed sort of to have a place called home. So I was transferred from Grand Haven to be the director of auxiliary services, and I was transferred to Governor's Island, New York. Governor's Island, New York is next to Ellis Island, which is off the tip of Manhattan. It was self-contained. It had churches, schools, commissary, big houses. And because I had 6 children, I got to live on Colonel's Row, some of the biggest homes with 13 feet oak sliding doors and 4 working fireplaces and a ballroom on the 3rd floor and a front entrance and a back entrance with spiral staircases in both. It was an experience. And that job I knew would be my last Coast Guard job. I knew for a variety of reasons, one of which was they announced that Governor's Island, which was previously owned and run by the Coast Guard, was being closed by the Coast Guard due to the cost, because you could only get there by ferry, a lot of other costs. And so while I was there, and I worked with auxiliaries in New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut, and really guided them in terms of volunteer service and did the recognition pieces that go with that. But on a personal note, saw 28 Broadway shows in 2 years. My father-in-law had been ailing in Connecticut. We were able to host him. My family is from right there. We had large gatherings, parties, First Holy Communions, and sadly my father-in-law passed away while we were there. But we were able to enjoy time with him there. So that experience in New York was, in some cases, sad, but in most cases, a terrific opportunity. And the children, if I stayed in the job and stayed longer in the Coast Guard, would have to have then gone off the island to school, to 3 different schools. And I said, you know what, it's time to retire. So I said goodbye to the Coast Guard and retired in September 30th of 1996 and came to work for the Grand Haven Area Public Schools as the Director of Community Education, in charge of 14 programs, and then eventually I worked for the curriculum division of the Grand Haven Area Public Schools. And that was a rewarding experience, but it was partially state funded. So that job, if you will, funding ran out. I left that job and then accepted a position at the Union Rescue Mission on Skid Row in Los Angeles, and was the director of volunteer services there for 3 years. Worked with the homeless. We fed 2,100 people a day, slept 800 different people a night. It was overwhelmingly spiritual, but also humanitarian, comforting, scary. And I commuted back to Grand Haven every 5th week because my family was still here. I neglected to say that obviously when I retired, I moved back to Grand Haven to work for the school system, so we all traveled together. And we had kept our house when I was here, so we knew that we're coming back to something familiar.
Was this, the Skid Row thing was a Catholic organization?
No, it's not.
Okay.
No, very evangelical. But the president of the International Aide here in Spring Lake was a family friend, and he became the president of the Union Rescue Mission. One of the most interesting things about that, being besides aiding the homeless in Los Angeles, which is incredibly a huge population, was the expression falling off the wagon developed at the Union Rescue Mission because it was the Union Rescue gospel wagon that would travel around spreading the word of God in an evangelical way. And in order to receive clothing and spiritual uplifting, you had to come every week. And if you came for 3 weeks and then didn't come the 4th weeks, the expression was that you had fallen off the wagon and therefore were not part of the movement. So I did that for 3 years, met some interesting, incredible people, some very selfless people, some Hollywood actors. The volunteers did the whole spectrum. I remember a group of 5 tattooed men, scary, with teardrops tattooed under their eye, tattoos running up their big, burly piercings, and they wanted to volunteer for me at the Union Rescue Mission. They had already gone through the first security level to get to my office. There was no way in hell that I was going to tell them no, they couldn't volunteer. As it turned out, when they came in, I said, well, why do you want to volunteer? And they said, well, we've all been in prison for over 10 years, some 15 years. So I said yes, and one guy said, yes, I killed his brother. And they had done their time, and they wanted to continue to become a productive member of society. And they wanted to start by helping out at this mission. They became so cohesive that they formed an entertainment group called Suspect Entertainment. And they played themselves in cop shows, in the Fast and Furious. They played bad guys. And they were very successful in their out of jail endeavors, but they were scary to talk to. And they did eventually volunteer at the mission. So I had that, and the other spectrum was I had the church ladies from Bel Air, a very affluent church where Ronald Reagan went, and Raquel Welch, and a very generous group. They gave millions of dollars to the Union Rescue Mission for improving the lives of homelessness and of the homeless in Los Angeles. So I saw everything. And I did that for 3 years, but the commute and missing my family became a lot. So I left that position to accept the position I'm now in as the executive director of the Grand Haven Coast Guard Festival, where I've come full circle to honor the men and women of the United States Coast Guard, the people that I worked with, went to school with, and whose work I love.
Where did this Coast Guard Festival concept come from? There was a Coast Guard presence here before there was a festival? I mean, how did that all work out?
The history of the Grand Haven Coast Guard Festival starts with the Coast Guard. At the life-saving station in Grand Haven, it was small, but one day a year they would have a picnic, and it was only for their families. Coast Guard men, because there was only men in the Coast Guard then, and their families, and they would come and then have a picnic. But during the course of that picnic, they would compete in games against each other. Who could row the fastest across the Grand River, who could throw life rings, who could put on life-saving equipment, and it became a friendly competition. It was so successful that this life-saving station invited other life-saving stations close by in Holland and Manistee and Ludington to come to Grand Haven to enjoy this camaraderie and then also to compete. So this life-saving station was competing against another one. When the citizens of Grand Haven, who are on this side of the river, they would come down and watch the competition. And now we're into 1924. I mean, and they're saying, hey, we need to honor the men of the Coast Guard. So they decided to hold a parade. I find this hysterical because the whole parade was actually watching the Coast Guard people march down the street, and they're applauded by all the citizens, but you know, normally the people you're honoring are watching something. They were actually the parade, and people cheered them, etc. And then it grew. You know, there were more ways to honor the Coast Guard than just watching them march down the street. So they started to add things. And one of the things was a memorial service. And this is way before the Escanaba. There was a memorial service to remember those that had passed over the bar, if you will. That's an expression that the Coast Guard uses when you have gone on. And the memorial service was part of the celebration. So there was parades and there was competitions, but there was also a more solemn part. That more solemn part took on a whole lot greater meaning because as time went on, Grand Haven had ships that were stationed here. There were a lot more Coast Guard presence besides the life-saving station. There was other smaller facilities from the Coast Guard that were stationed here and around. So the presence grew. And then the Coast Guard cutter Escanaba in 1943 was called out to war. They took off equipment from the ship and prepared it for war. They took off the mast, etc. And on June 13th, 1943, with the sons, the grandsons, the brothers of area residents were the seamen on that ship. It sank mysteriously. Still not sure if it was a torpedo or not or German sub, don't know. But it blew up. There were 2 survivors. Those 2 survivors made it a point to be part of that memorial, not only for that year where the year the ship had blown up, but also in subsequent years. The citizens rallied during that time to raise money to build another Escanaba. And although that other Escanaba with Grand Haven money into war bonds was built, it never was stationed in Grand Haven. So the strength of the Coast Guard presence here, connecting to the festival, now has the center point as the National Memorial Service. And around it surrounds the flurry of excitement that has shows and carnivals and parades and Kids' Day and Senior Day, celebrating the joys of those that serve in the name of the United States Coast Guard. But the heart of it is that memorial service.
How are we doing on time here?
It's 20:02.
Oh, yeah, we still have some time. Because I think they're gonna start to
Yeah.
make their noises after that. So what is it you do?
As the executive
Yeah.
director, I inherited a program that was in flux. And I was the first Coast Guard person to be in the position. It was a part-time position for some, and there was a full-time paid for others who had a business background. But when I arrived, I came with all the glory of a Coast Guard officer and the connecting pieces. So what I do is work with the United States Coast Guard in building what the celebration will look like in terms of what's the theme, who are we honoring, why should we honor this particular group or that particular group during this particular year. Last year was the 100th anniversary of Coast Guard Aviation. A year before that was 225 years of the United States Coast Guard. So we're celebrating the birth of 1790, August 4th, Alexander Hamilton, which coincidentally matched the national fever, if you will, to see the Broadway show, Hamilton. And I worked all year, and we had the great-great-great-great-great-great-grandson of Alexander Hamilton as part of our celebration. So what I do is, knowing that the Coast Guard is being celebrated, I put the pieces together. So,
Well, you put together a lot of things before. This one can't be that, I mean, it's a difficult one. I know you putting something citywide is difficult. Do you get a lot of people coming from, I mean, not the public coming from out of town, but do you get Coast Guard people coming?
yes, from
Okay.
all over the world. And interesting, now that we've shared my background, is that I didn't realize that all those other assignments would lead to this. You know, the writing the speeches, now I'm giving speeches. The setting up events and logistics, I'm doing all that.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting how you come full circle.
Yes,
And this is where you want to settle though, right?
I am settled
Yeah.
here. This is my hometown.
Yeah.
My mother doesn't necessarily like that, but when my daughter got married last summer and all my relatives came, they understood it completely.
Well, my wife and I fell in love with it. We, Grand Rapids, living in the city, but being out here, you get the sense of community, but also you get the sense of privacy too.
Coincidentally, last year, when we were saluting aviation, we sent away, because every year we have a commemorative pin. We work with a organization in San Antonio, a business, and they ship out these pins to China. So 2 months before the festival is to start, the design that I had created, the pins arrive from China, and it says the Grand Heaven Coast Guard Festival. And for so many reasons, that really wasn't a mistake. It really was a mistake, but they then recreated the correct spelling. But it said a whole lot about the celebration last year and sort of where we are in the world in terms of beauty, natural beauty, people, values, and those pins were a hot commodity.
So you didn't have to send them back.
I did not have to send them back.
Is there anything you can think of that we haven't covered that you would like to say for?
I would say that the Coast Guard is a surprise. It's a well-kept secret. Although it's the smallest military armed force, it is filled with so many things that excite. You can be one day command of a ship, a patrol boat in New York Harbor. But the next day, you could be in charge of a group of small search and rescue stations, or you could be recruiting at the national level, or you could be traveling around the world and letting somebody else speak your words. It is a hidden treasure. If you're interested in marine biology, environmental protection, port security, drug interdiction, search and rescue, boating safety, the missions of the Coast Guard are all exciting, enticing, and grab a different element, and they bring different personalities of people into the Coast Guard to mesh, to make us what we are. And it's really a family. And so for somebody that's family oriented, for me, it was a perfect match. And that's my sort of give of my Coast Guard. It prepared me to be who I needed to become, gave me skill sets that I wanted but didn't know I needed, and it gave me a very rewarding series of opportunities that created a life for me and my family.